General Hospital spoilers reveal that Jossly had always been brave, sometimes too brave for her own good. But she had never imagined that stepping onto the mist-soaked shores of Spoon Island would drag her into the darkest, most intricate conspiracy Port Charles had faced in years. The air itself felt wrong that night, thick with secrets, humming with a kind of electrical tension that seemed to vibrate beneath the ground. Windermere loomed in the distance like a fortress guarding its own sins. And although Jossly had grown up around danger, around Sunny's endless battles and Carlyle's storms of chaos, she sensed immediately that whatever was happening here on Spoon Island was different. It was cold, calculated, scientific, and almost surgical in its brutality. It wasn't chaos, it was design. She came because she had found patterns, clues, quiet anomalies that other people ignored, shipments to the island that never passed customs, encrypted messages referencing stability vectors and bioreactive thresholds, and Britt's sudden change in behavior each time Sidwell's name surfaced. And when Marco Lucas's charming, too-perfect boyfriend started appearing in documents he should never have been anywhere near, something inside Jossly snapped into focus. Someone needed to get to the truth. She had always been her mother's daughter that way. And so she crossed the water under a fractured moon, armed with only her intuition, her phone, and the determination that had once carried her through kidnappings, losses, betrayals, and heartbreaks that would have crushed anyone weaker. But as she stepped into the tunnels beneath Windermere, she realized she was no longer dealing with emotional threats, she was dealing with intelligence, technology, and men who had spent their entire lives constructing systems of control that made even Sunny's empire look primitive. Jossly didn't know she had already made her first mistake before she even reached the stone steps leading underground. Marco had been following her digital footprint for days, monitoring her research queries, watching the way she questioned Lucas, tracking the way her curiosity shifted from casual to obsessive. Sidwell had warned him that someone might begin connecting the dots, and Marco, who now acted as Sidwell's eyes, ears, and dagger, recognized the danger immediately. Jossly was not just another nosy girl. She was Carlyle's daughter, Sunny's pressure point, and the perfect pawn in a much larger plan. Jossly believed she was alone when she slipped into the dim corridor, flashlight trembling in her hand as she held it against the wall to avoid being seen. Every sound echoed to sharply the drip of distant water, the scuttling of something small, her own heartbeat pulsing like a drum inside her ears. She followed a set of deep grooves carved into the floor, leading her to a door hidden behind a false stone panel. When she pried it open, the metallic hiss made her flinch, but she forced herself inside and nearly choked when she saw what was waiting beyond. A makeshift laboratory lined with cold metal tables, wires snaking across the floor, screens displaying incomprehensible data streams of chemical reactions and neural mapping sequences. This wasn't research. It was weaponization. Sidwell wasn't trying to change the world, he was trying to control it. And if Sunny ever learned of this, he would burn the island to ashes. Jossly recorded everything she could, capturing images of vials, prototypes, coded formulas she knew Spinelli could decode. Every piece of evidence felt like another nail in Sidwell's coffin. But she didn't realize that with every second she lingered, every breath she took inside that lab, her image was being streamed to Sidwell's private surveillance network. She didn't realize Marco stood in the next room, jaw clenched, eyes darkening as he received Sidwell's orders through a discreet earpiece. She didn't hear Sidwell's voice, cold and amused, declaring, "She's the perfect leverage. Bring her to me." She didn't know she had just become a target in a game she didn't understand. But she felt something shift, a vibration in the floor, a breath of air that didn't belong. When she turned, her light flickered across a shadow, moving with a precision that sent a surge of panic up her spine. She ran, not because she was weak, but because she finally understood she was being hunted. The tunnels twisted unpredictably, turning her into a rat in a maze designed by a predator. She sprinted down one corridor only to find another locked door, backtracked through another passage only to reach a dead end. Her lungs burned, her pulse hammered, and each sound, each footstep that was not her own grew louder, closer, more deliberate. Marco wasn't rushing. He didn't need to. He knew these halls like his own heartbeat. Jossly stumbled into a vast, circular chamber she had not seen before. Stone pillars lined the walls, and in the center, a massive iron grate covered something deep and dark. When she leaned over it, her stomach dropped. It wasn't a storage space. It was a containment pit, and it wasn't empty. Movement rippled beneath the darkness, followed by a metallic clang, as though something or someone was trapped below. Brit, Anna, someone else. Sidwell wanted to keep quiet. Jossly didn't have time to find out. The moment she backed away from the grate, Marco stepped into the light, his expression stripped of all humanity, revealing the loyal, obedient creature Sidwell had fashioned him into. "You shouldn't be here," he said, not out of concern, but out of calculation. She ran again, darting behind pillars, slipping through gaps, praying Marco would misstep or slow down. But the tunnels were his domain, and she was a trespasser. And worse, she was valuable. Sidwell watched it all from his command center, smiling with the satisfaction of a man who had just acquired a weapon more potent than any chemical formula. Jossly wasn't just a girl. She was Sonny's soft spot, the one thing he would sacrifice everything for. If Sidwell had her, he could shatter Sonny without lifting a gun. The realization crushed Jossly as she dodged through another corridor. Sidwell didn't want to silence her. He wanted to use her, to pressure Sonny, to manipulate Lucas, to corner the Corinthos family with a hostage they couldn't ignore. For a moment, Jossly pictured her mother's face, Sonny's fury, Michael's panic, and Trina's tears, and she felt a crushing anguish in her chest. She had come here for truth, but now she was drowning in a war she never meant to ignite. She refused to give up. She climbed, pushed, crawled through cracks in the stone walls, ignoring the pain slicing across her hands. But Marco was relentless. The closer he came, the colder the air felt, as if the tunnels themselves were surrendering her to him. And when he finally reached her, cornering her against a sealed iron gate that wouldn't budge no matter how hard she pushed, she knew she had seconds left before Sidwell's plan fully snapped into place. Marco didn't grab her violently. He didn't need to. His calmness was far more terrifying. "Jossly," he said softly, "you've become very important." Her blood iced, because she understood now. She wasn't a casualty. She was leverage. Spoon Island wasn't haunted by ghosts, it was haunted by Sidwell's genius. And she had just become the centerpiece of his newest negotiation. And as Marco reached for her, Jossly realized the truth that made her heart nearly stop. She had walked onto this island, searching for secrets, but she didn't realize she was destined to become one. Jossly Jax was now the pressure point Sidwell would use to make Sonny fall, and the island that once held only scientific horrors was about to become her prison. The adjustment had begun, and nothing in Port Charles would ever be the same again. Lucas Jones had spent most of his life trying to be the kind of man who resolved conflict through patience, compassion, and reason. A man who chose healing over violence, understanding over fear, and forgiveness over condemnation. Yet none of those qualities helped him on the night he realized Jossly Jax was missing, and Marco Rios, the charming, magnetic man he had allowed himself to trust, defend, and love, was the one responsible for dragging her into the shadows of Spoon Island. The moment Lucas discovered the truth, something in him fractured, something that had been slowly weakening under the pressure of suspicion, doubt, and the small inconsistencies that had been piling up around Marco like cracks in a glass surface, waiting for the final touch to shatter everything. When he learned through Britt's terrified confession that Marco was working under Sidwell's orders, that Jossly had stumbled into something far more dangerous than she understood, the fear that surged through Lucas was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was a consuming, burning, desperate panic that swallowed every rational impulse he had left. He didn't hesitate. He didn't think. He simply ran toward Windermere, toward the tunnels, toward the place where he knew Marco would corner Jossly like a pawn in Sidwell's game. And the only thought echoing through him was that he could not fail her. Not after everything Sonny and Carly had done for him. Not after everything Jossly had survived. Not when he still believed, despite his complicated relationship with Sonny, that protecting family was the one moral code every Corinthos adjacent heart shared. The tunnels were colder than he expected, darker, too quiet except for the distant thrum of machines and the faint hum of Sidwell's hidden experiments. Every step felt like stepping deeper into a nightmare he didn't belong in, but he pushed forward, adrenaline forcing him past his own shaking breath. As he followed the echoes of Jocelyn's voice, muffled, frightened, trying to reason with someone who no longer cared about reason. And then he saw him, Marco, the man he had let into his home, into his life, into the most vulnerable corners of his heart, standing between Jocelyn and freedom with an expression Lucas had never seen before, an expression devoid of warmth, devoid of humanity, devoid of the tenderness Marco had once pretended to show. Jocelyn was cornered, her back against a sealed iron gate, her face pale with terror yet fierce with defiance, a combination that reminded Lucas so painfully of Carly that it nearly broke him. When Marco turned and saw Lucas emerging from the shadows, his features hardened not with guilt, not with regret, but with an unsettling calmness that chilled Lucas more than anger ever could. "You shouldn't be here," Marco said quietly, as if they were discussing a minor inconvenience instead of a life-and-death situation unfolding in the dim bowels of the island. Something inside Lucas snapped. All the months of denial, confusion, loyalty, and misplaced trust collided with the horror of seeing Jocelyn trapped, and Lucas moved before he even registered the motion. He didn't attack out of hatred or revenge, he lunged out of instinct, out of a primal need to protect the girl who had become part of his extended family, the girl who should never have been dragged into Marco's twisted allegiance to Sidwell. The struggle that followed was chaotic, desperate, and unlike anything Lucas had ever experienced. He had no training, no strategy, nothing except fear and raw determination guiding him. Marco tried to restrain him, tried to defuse the situation, perhaps even attempted to manipulate Lucas again with that deceptive softness he used to weaponize affection. But Lucas had crossed the threshold of no return. Every lie Marco had ever told him, every excuse, every manipulation, every moment Lucas had defended him against Carly's suspicions, all of it exploded in Lucas's mind, like a storm he could no longer contain. And in the chaos of the confrontation, in the frantic scramble to stop Marco from reaching Jocelyn again, in the split second where everything narrowed into instinct and movement, Marco fell. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was abrupt, disorienting, silent. One misstep, one loss of balance, one irreversible moment that ended with Marco lying motionless on the cold stone floor, while Lucas stood trembling, breath shattering in his chest, staring at the consequences of a decision he hadn't even consciously made. Jocelyn rushed to Lucas, grabbing his arm, urging him to move, to breathe, to understand that they didn't have time to process what had just happened, because Sidwell's men could be seconds away from discovering them. But Lucas couldn't move, not at first. His mind screamed that Marco had been a monster, a threat, a calculated manipulator serving a man far more dangerous. Yet another part of him, the part that had once envisioned a future with Marco, felt like it was collapsing under the weight of grief and betrayal. He hadn't wanted this. He hadn't intended this. He had acted to protect Jocelyn. Yet the reality of what he had done settled on him like a suffocating fog. But Jocelyn, shaken yet focused, pulled him out of the paralysis. "We have to go," she whispered, urgency sharpening her voice. And Lucas finally forced himself away from the sight, guiding her through the tunnels as alarms began to echo in the distance. Sidwell wasn't going to stay blind for long. Marco's death was not just a tragedy, it was a catalyst, a spark that would ignite Sidwell's fury and shift the entire war brewing beneath Port Charles into something far more violent, far more personal, far more unpredictable. Lucas and Jocelyn emerged from the tunnels breathless, traumatized, and forever changed, each carrying a truth they could not speak aloud. Nothing in their lives would ever be the same. After this night, Lucas, once gentle and soft-spoken, now carried the weight of a life taken, a life he had once cared for. Jocelyn, once impulsive but hopeful, now understood the consequences of digging too deeply into the wrong secrets. And Sidwell, upon discovering Marco's fate, unleashed a wrath that would ripple through every corner of Port Charles, turning the island incident into the beginning of a new nightmare, one centered not on science or ambition, but on vengeance. The adjustment had begun, the explosion had happened, and the disaster unfolding was far from over. Sidwell had always considered himself a man of precision, logic, and ruthless intellect. someone who could calculate risk and consequence with the calm detachment of a surgeon. But when the news of Marco's death reached him, delivered through a trembling subordinate, and confirmed by the silent feed of the Spoon Island surveillance system, something inside him snapped in a way no one had ever witnessed before. Marco had not simply been an asset. He had been the closest thing Sidwell had to family, a loyal extension of his will, a figure he had shaped and sharpened over years of manipulation, training, and psychological conditioning. And the realization that Marco was gone, killed during a struggle that should never have occurred, ignited a fury in Sidwell, so toxic it burned through every disciplined facade he had built. The grief came first, raw and unbearable, a soundless collapse of his internal world as he replayed Marco's final moments over and over, analyzing each movement, each frame, each breath, searching for meaning, blame, and weakness. But grief was too fragile for a man like Sidwell. Within hours, it calcified into something cold, predatory, and obsessive. A new adjustment began within him, a shift from strategist to executioner, from manipulator to avenger, from man to monster. The only thing left inside him was the need to retaliate, to make those responsible suffer with a precision so devastating that the entire city of Port Charles would tremble under the weight of his wrath. And at the very center of that wrath were three names: Carly, Jocelyn, and Lucas. In Sidwell's mind, Lucas had delivered the fatal blow, but Jocelyn had triggered the confrontation by interfering with experiments she had no right to investigate, and Carly, by her mere existence, represented the Corinthos loyalty that Sidwell despised with every fiber of his being. They were linked, intertwined in the chain of events that had led to the death of the one person Sidwell valued, and he vowed to dismantle each of them piece by piece until their lives mirrored the anguish carved into his own. He began by activating old contacts, silent operatives who owed him favors or feared his reach, setting into motion a series of disruptions crafted not to kill immediately, but to destabilize, frighten, and disorient. Strange cars began tailing Carly at night, shadows lingered outside her home, and anonymous calls interrupted her sleep with static-laced threats. Jocelyn, still struggling to process everything she had survived on Spoon Island, felt eyes on her even when alone, heard footsteps behind her in empty hallways at school, and sensed a creeping danger pressing closer each day. Lucas, already broken by guilt, found himself trapped in a tightening psychological vice as Sidwell's people began watching him openly, making no attempt to hide their surveillance. A clear message that Lucas's days of anonymity were gone, that every step he took, every breath he drew, belonged to Sidwell's vengeance now. The fear spreading through the trio was not accidental. Sidwell orchestrated it with meticulous detail, intending to erode their stability, fracture their relationships, and make them crumble long before he delivered the finishing strike. His obsession grew unchecked, evolving into a haunting presence that stretched across the city like a dark fog, creeping into every corner of the Corinthos and Spencer circles. It didn't take long for Sonny to sense the shift, the way danger seemed to pulse through Port Charles with a familiar rhythm, the way Jocelyn's eyes darted toward windows and Lucas flinched at every unexpected noise. Jason, with his lethal intuition, pieced together the pattern even faster. He saw the fingerprints of a mastermind, someone who operated without emotion, yet was driven by it. Someone who didn't rely on brute force, but on psychological warfare, chessboard strategy, and perfectly timed strikes. When Sonny and Jason learned the truth that Marco was dead, that Lucas had killed him during a desperate attempt to protect Jocelyn, and that Sidwell now believed the Corinthos family was responsible for his loss, everything crystallized into a single, alarming reality. Sidwell was not merely reacting, he was preparing, and if they didn't act soon, if they didn't take control of the situation and redirect the trajectory of this new threat, Sidwell's vengeance would not remain focused on intimidation, it would escalate into bloodshed. Sonny knew that Sidwell's grief-driven fury could level families, burn alliances, and shatter the fragile peace holding Port Charles together. And Jason understood with chilling clarity that Sidwell would not stop until Carly, Jocelyn, and Lucas were destroyed emotionally, legally, or physically. The two men stood on the brink of a new war, forced to acknowledge that this was not a mob rival or a street-level threat. This was a man whose mind operated like a weapon, sharp, unyielding, unpredictable. Sidwell's descent into obsession marked a catastrophic adjustment in the balance of power, pushing Port Charles toward a disaster none of them were prepared for. As Sonny and Jason prepared for their next move, collecting information, strengthening their defenses, and trying to stay one step ahead, they both understood the truth. Marco's death was only the beginning. Sidwell's vengeance was rising like a tide, unstoppable and merciless. And unless they intervened immediately, Port Charles would soon face one of the darkest shocks in its history, a tragedy born not from crime, but from grief twisted into madness.